Paul's letter to the believers in Rome moves, in its 6th chapter, from doctrine to duty, having just declared in chapter 5 that grace abounded all the more where sin increased. Paul anticipates an objection voiced by his opponents. Shall those under grace continue sinning so that grace may increase further? He answers with sharp denial, then turns to baptism to explain why such continuance is unthinkable. Those baptized into Christ, he says, were baptized into his death. They were buried with him through baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the Father's glory, they too might walk in newness of life. United with him in the likeness of his death, they will also be united with him in the likeness of his resurrection. It is at this point, still addressing the practical ethical consequence of baptism, that Paul writes the verse now under consideration. The verse reads, knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin. Read in its setting, without importing categories foreign to the argument, the verse describes a change of moral standing and behavior, brought about through identification with Christ's death, not a metaphysical fusion of natures. The phrase old man, in Greek ho palaios anthropos, names the former manner of life, the person as shaped by disobedience. It is crucified together with Christ, sinistorote, an act tied historically to Golgotha, but appropriated by the believer through the rite Paul has just described, baptism into a likeness, an image of that death. Paul chooses the word likeness deliberately in the preceding verse. He does not say believers are made one substance with Christ, but that they share the pattern of his dying and rising. 2 verses later he speaks of having obeyed from the heart the form of doctrine, typos, that was delivered, the very word used elsewhere for a pattern to be traced or copied. The body of sin is not annihilated at once. It is rendered powerless, katagete, so that its former mastery ends and sin no longer commands obedience. Everything here concerns conduct, mastery, and freedom from sin's rule, which is precisely why Paul opened the chapter with the question of whether grace excuses continuing to sin. The passage answers an ethical problem with an ethical remedy, dying to the old pattern of life by following in commitment and practice the pattern Christ himself set. This reading coheres with the wider picture given of Christ as the one whom the Father, moved by his own free goodness, set before mankind as the model of a new life, raising him on the third day and afterward granting him great authority in heaven and on earth, not as something he possessed by nature, but as a reward for his obedience even to death on a cross. Philippians states this order plainly. Christ humbled himself, became obedient to the point of death, and therefore God highly exalted him and gave him the name above every name. Exaltation follows obedience as its consequence. It is not the unveiling of a status already possessed from eternity. The same pattern of imitation appears again when Peter writes that Christ suffered for believers, leaving them an example, hypogrammon, a copy line such as a child traces in learning to write, so that they should follow in his steps. An example is followed by someone genuinely distinct from the one who said it. A copy line is traced, not absorbed into. This is the same relationship Romans 6 presupposes between the believer and Christ crucified. Those who read the union with Christ, described here as requiring more than moral and covenantal identification, often argue that being crucified and buried with Christ presupposes a real, almost immediate spiritual presence of Christ within every believer at once, something they judge possible only if Christ shares the Father's infinite, unbounded nature. They further hold that sin's condemnation could only be dealt with by a sacrifice of infinite worth, which in turn requires the one sacrifice to be God himself. Yet the text supplies its own account of the mechanism, and it is baptismal and exemplary rather than ontological. Burial with Christ, resurrection in newness of life, the form of teaching obeyed, the old man put off. Paul repeats this same language in writing to the Ephesians and the Colossians, where believers are told to put off the old man and put on the new, renewed after the image of the one who created him, plainly an ethical transformation of character, not a claim about two natures joined in one person. Nowhere in the chapter does Paul argue from Christ's deity to the believer's death to sin. He argues from Christ's historical death and resurrection, made available through baptism, to a life no longer serving sin. If the passage intended to teach that only a divine Christ could unite himself with the believer, The reasoning given, likeness, pattern, form, example, would be a strange and roundabout way of teaching it. Read on its own terms. The 6th chapter of Romans presents forgiveness as flowing from the Father's own resolve to pardon those who forsake sin. And it presents Christ as the obedient, commissioned man through whose death and resurrection that resolve is confirmed and whose steps believers are called to retrace. The old man crucified with him is the sinner's former self, put to death by turning from disobedience to the pattern Christ traced. The body of sin destroyed is sin's rule broken by that same turning. Nothing in the wording asks the hearer to look past this moral drama toward a hidden union of natures. The verse yields its full sense, and the whole chapter its coherence, once Christ is recognized as the appointed exemplar of the new obedience rather than a co-equal deity fused invisibly with the believer. In closing, I want to encourage you, examine for yourself, search diligently, read the scriptures with an open and rational mind. Socinianism does not rest on tradition or church authority, but on the conviction that God's truth is rational, clear, and morally sublime. If this perspective has resonated with you and you wish to explore the biblical Unitarian view further, visit www.socinianismus.de for in-depth articles, studies, and reflections on central theological questions. If this video has been helpful, please support this work with a like. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss another contribution on the unity of God, the teaching of Jesus, and the rational interpretation of Scripture. Until the next video.